This video references the newly spoiled 9th edition Tyranids Codex. You can check out a full review of the Codex by clicking on the link on the screen right here or down below in the video description. Enjoy! Ever since I've started with 8th edition 40k, I've loved psychic phase armies. Dealing mortal wounds and assembling delicate combos of optimal psychic powers has been some of the most fun I've had playing the game of 40k. Even to the point that in 8th edition, I had a Grey Knights army that I played the absolute crap out of and loved very much. But in the 9th edition Grey Knights Codex, the army became more of a standard run-and-gun style marine army with a psychic flair, and I was disappointed. So you can imagine my excitement for the new 9th edition Tyranids Codex and the power and potential for super awesome combos that its psychic phase represents. So today I'd like to talk about why 9th edition Tyranids are the best psychic army in Warhammer 40,000. Let's do it! What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about the Tyranid Psychic Phase, some of the swath of psychic options that the faction has, the insane math of Tyranid Psychic tests, as well as some of the most important Tyranid Psychic units, and one way to combo it all together to deal absolutely massive damage. As always, if you enjoy this style of content, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, maybe drop a comment down below about how degenerate you think Tyranids are. Any of those things would be great and really help out. I appreciate it. And then let's get into the video. One benefit that Tyranids have always had in the Psychic phase has been their volume of Psychers. You have to take HQ choices in any 40k army. That's just a rule, because they're compulsory in every single detachment type. And fortunately for Tyranids, most of their HQ options are also randomly Psychers. These include all three variants of the Hive Tyrant, the Winged, Foot, and Swarmlord versions, Broodlords, Tervigons, and Neurothropes. In fact, only the primes, the Trigon and Tyranid primes, are in that slot but aren't Psychers. And those certainly aren't auto takes in a Tyranid list. Coupled with the non-character Psyker options, a very strong psychic discipline with very few duds on it, basically just the Horror is the only psychic power I would discount from the Hive Mind discipline, as well as a swath of absolutely awesome faction-specific powers from each Hive fleet. This means that every Tyranid list will have an insane volume of Psychers and useful powers for them to cast. So having extra casting slots to dedicate to casting those powers or to performing psychic actions like Psychic Interrogation or Warp Ritual is easy peasy. If you combine that with support stratagems like Power of the Hive Mind or Synaptic Channeling to spread the love around a little bit, without even trying, a Tyranid Psychic phase can be highly diverse and very effective. And this is without even taking into account the insane buffs that Tyranids can use to supplement it. Speaking of which, let's talk about those. So let's talk about all the awesome support effects that the Tyranid Psychic phase has access to. Their psychic representation hasn't really changed from the 8th edition Codex. Most of their psychic HQs have remained, and their number of casts has generally stayed the same, although you're a little bit more incentivized to take some more of the support casters, especially non-character units. The Hive Mind discipline, likewise, is also relatively unchanged, with some of the powers getting reworked slightly and the introduction of Neuroparasite. The big difference are these support effects that can be overlaid on top, especially when you use them on a Neurothrope. Neurothropes have an innate +1 to cast all of their powers, which can be buffed to a +2 to cast with the Residence Barb relic. And having a Neurothrope gives access to their Synaptic Imperative for a third +1 to cast, this time affecting the whole army. But that's not the only way that Neurothropes can buff the army's psychic powers, because they also have the Warp Siphon ability, a command phase Synaptic Link that gives another die to a Psyker's test, dropping one of your choice. Let's talk about this ability for a sec and take a trip to the AnyDice website, a super useful resource, to do some math. Math. On average, 3d6 drop the lowest die is roughly equivalent to +2 to the result on a normal 2d6 roll. The chances to score a 7+, which is the most likely result on a 2d6 roll, and a really important number to score, which we'll talk about later, bumps from around 56% to over 80% immediately just by applying this Warp Siphon to the caster. This means that through the use of a single free command phase ability, you can get those tough Warp Charge 7 spells off very reliably. I've talked in the past about how little I like game plans that are reliant on psychic powers, and especially psychic powers that are warp charge 7 or higher, because of the difficulty to cast. Without any buffs, you're looking at a coin flip to activate a power that might be crucial to your game plan, which is just not reliable enough. But Tyranids make that so much easier. And this gets even better under any other buff. With a +1 from the Neurothrope Synaptic Imperative or their just ability themselves, if they're casting the power by themselves, that 7+ result becomes a staggering 89% success rate, meaning that with any single command point reroll, you're over 98% to get that 7+ to cast. If you add in any additional buffs, the roll becomes all but unfailable. Now, a common issue with these kind of psychic armies becomes Peril of the Warp, but don't worry, Warp Siphon has your back there too, because the ability allows you to discard any of the dice results, not just the lowest. So you'd need to roll triple 1s or triple 6s to ever concretely suffer Perils of the Warp, approximately a 1% chance. And the best part is that this ability is spammable. With Synaptic Tendrils, you could be buffing 2 units with a single Neurothrope, and it just gets better if you include more Neurothropes in the list. So now let's talk about some units that you might want to be buffing with that insane Neurothrope power. We've talked about the volume of psychic casts available to the Tyranid faction and the consistency of its psychic test math. So let's talk about the backbone of Tyranid psychic lists and how they benefit from these insane buffs. Let's talk about Zoanthropes. Zoanthropes are going to be included in most Tyranid armies, since they grant access to what is probably the single strongest Synaptic Imperative. Their Warp Shielding ability to give a 4+ invulnerable save to all your monsters, or 5+ invulnerable save to your infantry. With that bonus, they also bring some utility in a cast and deny alongside knowing a spell. But the real glow on them is their Psychic Phase damage output. A minimum strength unit of Zoanthropes, which is 3 models when you include it in your list, adds +3 to its Psychic tests, casting nukes like Smite or Psychic Scream. And when casting Smite, plows its target for an additional 3 mortal wounds, extra mortal wounds equal to the number of models in the unit, up to a maximum of 3. This means on a baseline, they're dealing D3 plus 3 mortal wounds once they get that smite off. This degrades as the unit is attrition, but at its base level is an extreme delivery of mortal wounds, with a possible 9 mortal wounds delivered by a big super smite. For the uninitiated, that's a smite on a psychic test of 11+, which then deals D6 damage instead of D3, on top of that adding 3 for the remaining Zoanthropes in the unit. And the chance to deliver these super smites is pretty likely. Because of that bonus to cast, they start at a 41% chance to super smite, only needing to roll an 8+ on the 2d6 roll. That bumps up to a 58% under the effects of the Neurothrope Imperative, or under Warp Siphon, an impressive 68%. Another important thing to keep in mind is how good of a late phase smiter they are. One downside of the smite psychic power is that the more times you cast it in that psychic phase, the harder it gets to cast. But with a built-in bonus of +3 to cast smites, Zoanthropes can be late on the smite spam casting chain and still have a pretty reasonable shot at getting them off. Even if Zoanthropes are casting smite alone, it's actually impossible to fail if they're the first smiter of the phase. Even rolling double 1s on a 2d6 roll with a built-in +3 to cast will get you to that warp charge value of 5. And Perils of the Warp, while it does deal you damage on rolls of double 1s or double 6s, doesn't necessarily mean the power fails. It only fails if the unit's actually destroyed by the resulting perils. The passive output from this unit is extremely powerful, and pumping these little brainy boys with any psychic buffs sends it through the roof. And with all that in mind, it's important to remember that this is a support unit that will also be passively extending your Synaptic Link chain and providing you their awesome Synaptic Imperative. So Zoanthrope's mortal wound output is pretty insane, but even then, it's not nearly the apex of what the Tyranid Psychic Phase can accomplish. So to wrap up this video, let's assemble all of these different abilities together into a single concentrated ingot of mental chicanery that encapsulates the raw primal power of the Tyranid Psychic Phase. Let's talk about Maleceptors are a kind of funky little monster. They're a toughness 8, 15-1 body with a 4+ invulnerable save, and some reasonable melee stats. On the whole, not super impressive. But on top of that, they are a 2-cast, 1-deny psyker with a boatload of special rules. one of which allows them to do a psychic action. This is important later, especially because not being a character, it means you can't give them access to secondary actions like Warp Ritual or Mental Interrogation. So having one on their datasheet is a pretty big deal. What we're trying to abuse especially, though, is their Psychic Overload ability, which shoots the nearest enemy within 12, no line of sight required, which is important, for a number of automatic mortal wounds based on the Maleceptor's current bracket. Each time it completes a psychic test with a result of 7 or more. 3 mortal wounds at the top of their profile, decreasing to 2, and 1 as their wounds degrade. This seems pretty good, right? With the potential for delivering up to 6 free mortal wounds alongside its 2 casts is pretty sweet, but we can do more. With the power of the Hive Mind strat, we can allow this guy to cast another power, pushing its output to Smite, as well as its 2 known powers, alongside a potential 9 mortal wounds from the Psychic Overload ability if we get a 7+ on all 3 of those casts. But it doesn't stop there. I said earlier that the Maleceptor's built-in psychic action is pretty important. This is because the Maleceptor also gives access to its own Synaptic Imperative, allowing affected units to perform psychic actions in addition to casting their normal powers. For those keeping track at home, this allows the Maleceptor to cast 3 spells and do 1 psychic action, for a total of 4 psychic tests and a potential 12 mortal wounds. As we talked about in the last section, just using Warp Siphon gives you a solid 80% chance to score that 7+ to cast on every single one of those psychic tests. And even better, using the Highfleet Leviathan power, Hive Nexus, you can keep the Maleceptor affected by its own Synaptic Imperative alongside the Neurothrope's Imperative, getting us to that coveted 89% to trigger Psychic Overload, because you'll be rolling 3d6, drop the lowest with +1 from the Neurothrope Imperative, and giving you a solid chance to pump those 12 automatic mortal wounds into the closest hapless enemy. What makes this great is that the effect is line of sight agnostic, meaning that the Maleceptor can use it as sort of a roundabout indirect fire, in addition to any other damage from the powers it's actually casting. This is the ultimate example of the Tyranid Psychic phase doing work for them when everything is popping off. If you're casting a Smite, which has a pretty likely chance of doing a Super Smite, alongside a Neuroparasite and a Psychic Scream, the mortal wound output from a Maleceptor in a single Psychic phase can be easily 20 or more wounds. At 12 plus 2d3, potentially d6 plus d3, depending on whether your Smite is a Super Smite, in addition to whatever your Neuroparasite gets off. This is an absolute boatload of damage that the Maleceptor can be pouring into something. And again, these are mortal wounds. Most armies have no defense against them. Even armies that do, like Emperor's Chosen Adeptus Custodes, will soon be overwhelmed by the volume of mortal wounds that you're delivering to them. This is the ultimate example of the Tyranid Psychic phase doing work for them when everything is popping off. And it will be the central combo to a lot of Tyranid Psychic lists. Even lists not built around Tyranid Psychers will still be including most of the tools to use it, including Neurothropes and the Maleceptor itself, so the combo is relatively easy to assemble. Even outside Highfleet Leviathan, it's not going to be quite as efficient as we talked about here, but you can still do most of what we just talked about for a single turn. In my opinion, there is a future for a Tyranid Psychic-focused list that focuses specifically on Maleceptors, Zoanthropes, and Neurothropes, with the rest of the list existing in support of those units. With the majority of the output being mortal wounds, high defensive profiles, hit modifiers, and good invulnerable saves are no defense against the Tyranid army of this style. And there's going to be a lot of factions in the current metagame that will be absolutely obliterated by this type of army. Whether or not it's the most competitive army, I don't know. There are still a lot of failure modes, and some armies with high psychic defense will be able to shut it down, which makes it a little bit awkward. But it's important to remember that you still have the backbone of a Tyranid army supporting you, with Execrants, Hive Tyrants, Warriors, and other standard Tyranid profiles putting damage out in the other phases of the game, meaning that Tyranid's game plan overall is going to be relatively well-rounded. I'm so excited for this style of Tyranid Psychic list. I love dealing mortal wounds to people, so I'm certainly going to be testing out lists that utilize this combo as the core of what they do. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this kind of Tyranid army. Would you be willing to play with or against an army that deals this volume of mortal wounds in a single psychic phase? Let me know. And let me know if you think the Tyranids truly are the best psychic faction in the game. I think the amount of damage and the consistency of their casts certainly makes them a contender, even alongside armies like Grey Knights or Thousand Suns, and I couldn't be happier with the position that the Tyranid Psychic phase is in. That's going to be it for today. Thanks everybody for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks thanks to everybody who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. YouTube channel members as well as Twitch subscribers, everyone who helps me keep the lights on and talk about Tyranids. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.